I've seen agents who have sat in crisis for the last 2 years. They've literally sat in that crisis stage of, oh my gosh, everything's changing. And they have just swirled in it. And I've seen agents who have sat in chaos too. Like, well, there's so much opportunity and I don't know what to do. Like, I'm just going to wait and see what everybody else does. Mm-hmm. The people that get to adapt fastest win.
Welcome to the Real Estate Coffee House. Today's feature is Decaf Determination with Valerie Garcia. Michael and Valerie have a spot saved for you at their table. Enjoy the chat. Welcome to the Real Estate Coffee House podcast. I am Michael Thorne of Remax Lifestyles Realty and the Thorne Maisie Bongers Real Estate Group in Langley, BC. And because this is the first episode of this Real Estate Coffee House podcast, I do want to explain the name real quick before we introduce today's guest. And there's kind of two reasons for the name. Back in 2009, our team launched our very first podcast called The Real Estate Coffee Shop. And I hadn't put together the house pun yet, which it took me a while to figure out. It should be called Coffee House. And we actually recorded those episodes of that podcast in a local coffee shop with all the noise and conversation in the background. So it's kind of a tip of the cap to a podcast we started a long, long time ago before podcasts were kind of the norm. And number two, I think about all the interviews and the masterminds and the chats I've had over a cup of coffees in my real estate career, and all those little nuggets that come from sitting at a table and just talking real estate with some of the brightest people in the industry. And so that's what I really want this podcast to be, is for you to be able to pull up a chair and sit down and enjoy a conversation with a really smart person in the real estate industry. And so thus the Real Estate Coffee House podcast. So that brings me to our very first guest, and I reached out to this guest and I asked her, would you be my Bill Murray? And she responded with, what does that mean? And it's a kind of a tradition that David Letterman had, was to bring on Bill Murray as his first guest for each of his iterations of his show, kind of a good luck charm and a bit of a tradition. So there's no surprise that my very first guest is my good luck charm and my tradition, which is Valerie Garcia is our very first guest. So Valerie, thank you so much for joining us on this first episode of the Real Estate Coffee House podcast.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
And if you don't know Valerie, she is one of the best humans in the world, therefore in the real estate industry. She is one of the very best speakers I've ever heard. She is a dear friend of mine. She is a speaker, writer, consultant, and encourager, and the owner of Valerie Garcia Consulting, Valerie Garcia. So that brings us to the news.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
Each week, we take a few minutes with our guest to dig into a real estate story. And Valerie, I think as this goes on in different weeks, we're going to actually have one particular story we'll talk about where there's a link to a story and that you guys will find in the description. But I do want to talk about the Great Resignation. And we were chatting about this the other day. And before we even started the podcast and press record, you're like, I think it's changed a little bit. So let's spend a few minutes talking about the Great Resignation and how you see it evolving and how you see it affecting the real estate industry, not only as an industry, but for buyers and sellers, because it's something that we've heard a lot about, and we're starting to see the impact in all of our lives, this Great Resignation. And in recent days, we're recording this podcast on June 16th. There's a lot of news out of the States, a big hike in interest rates, fears about the economy changing, recession word being talked about. So how have you seen the impact of the Great Resignation, and how do you see it changing here in the coming weeks and months?
Well, I think it's been interesting the last year and a half to really watch the Great Resignation take place. I mean, we've seen some of the lowest numbers of unemployment in certainly our lives in the US and Canada. And as a result, there have been labor shortages. We've seen supply chain shortages. All of this is sort of dominoing together, but how it's affecting our consumers is we're seeing massive numbers of people move interstate and interprovincially. We're seeing people make decisions on housing based on not their commute, but where they actually want to live or can afford to live. And so that's having an impact on our consumers. They're considering places that they maybe have never considered before or would never have considered. We're seeing more people moving back towards family or away from family or, away from areas where they had to spend 2 or 3 hours commuting every day. So yeah, that's having an impact. But I think in the last couple of days, we've started to see a little bit of a weird shift in that regard too, where it's starting to feel a little bit less like the Great Resignation and more like the Great Layoff. I just watched a news story tonight where they were saying, the Great Resignation was great for people to make moves, but now those might be the first people to go when businesses have to cut back because they have the least seniority. So I think it will be really interesting to see what happens in the next couple of weeks and months and maybe even years in this regard, because I don't really think that we're ever going back to the way things were in terms of being in an office 5 days a week, every single day and commuting. Certainly not for most large corporations. I think a lot of large corporations have started to see the savings that they can get from having less overhead in large commercial real estate spaces. So I think this is a generational shift. I think for the next generation, we're going to see the impacts of this shuffle.
I completely agree. We have a series of questions, about 35 questions we ask buyers when we first sit down and meet them. And one of the key questions is, what is your willing commute time? What are you willing to do to commute? Because if the answer is 15 minutes, it really dictates where they're going to live. If it's 45 minutes, it's different. But if you eliminate that question altogether from the questionnaire, and therefore there's not a commute time requirement, it changes where a buyer can go. And we've definitely seen the contrast between property values in downtown Vancouver and the absolute outskirts of what we would still call the suburbs become much more level, not level, but more level as people go to the most affordable places to invest in real estate, thus increasing the demand in those markets, which makes them less affordable as people go out and take a look at that. Sure. It also changes too. If now you need to have a home office, it changes your needs in a home. It adds one more bedroom to a 2-bedroom family or a 3-bedroom family. It changes that quite a bit. It's going to be very interesting. And I do agree this is a generational thing. Yeah. And there's a win on both sides of it. I have talked to business owners that are like, my employees will take a few dollars an hour less because they don't have to give up a half an hour on the way to work and a half an hour back, and the gas that costs, and the insurance that it costs, and the sporting events they don't get to see their kids. So they're willing to take a bit of a pay cut to have that lifestyle. And at the end of it, both employer and employee come out ahead. It's definitely changed things dramatically. Now, I think we would have probably gotten there, Valerie, but COVID definitely accelerated us to realizing that there's other ways to be doing business.
Yeah, and I think we would be remiss in not putting hand in hand with what you just talked about, the very real impact of climate change. The reality is that we are seeing not only the Great Resignation, the impact of pandemic lifestyle for the last 18 months, but also massive climate change impacts in many areas. So we have people who are moving out of areas because of climate change, because of heat and earthquakes and fires. Fires are a huge one, floods. We have people that are choosing to live in areas because, long-term they want to be in a more secure area. And so that's going to have an impact long-term as well. Like if I don't want to commute and I don't have to commute and I want to live somewhere where I don't have to worry every season about losing my home to a wildfire, that's going to change where I want to live pretty dramatically. And it's actually going to start to compress the market in certain areas, and it's going to expand it in others. Where we've seen the most interstate moving in the US is to states that have little or no income tax. So if, half a dozen or more states in the US, and they're seeing a pretty big shift. We see not only businesses moving there, but people moving there. And we also see shifts away from places like the coast or away from Pacific Northwest or areas that are seeing pretty pronounced climate change. So I think it's going to be a very interesting decade to see how this all shakes down.
Now, on to the main meat and potatoes of the podcast, Decaf Determination. There's no way I would choose the name of the podcast when I have one of the most creative people. So I said, Valerie, what do you want to name? And she goes, we both love puns. So a little in your challenge is to get a pun in every title of this podcast is going to be a bit of a daunting task. But one of the reasons why I wanted you have you as our first guest is not only the tradition of it, is because I think what I want to talk to you about is a really good foundation of what I want this podcast to be. I mean, when you look at doing 12 episodes a season, we can talk about right now. You can say to me, these are the topics I wish the agents would listen to. And that's really what I want to talk about. We were having a conversation, probably over a cup of coffee, where you were talking about, and you've got decades in your history of education in the real estate industry in Canada, in the US, in Australia. And so you would send questionnaires out to realtors in advance of big conferences to find out what they wanted to learn. And you would get those surveys back. And you had made sort of a bit of a comment about this contrast once again between where you felt they should be checking the box for and voting for versus where they were. So talk about that, the sort of disconnect where you felt the topics were not lining up.
Yeah, I used to kind of chuckle about it because used to send, these surveys out in advance of events or in advance of planning education for the year, and would give agents, 30 topics and ask them to rank them highest to lowest in terms of what they most wanted to learn about. And it was a broad range. So everything from lead generation to marketing to QR codes back then to video to social media to, hiring an assistant. So, all manner of things that would impact your business. And it was really interesting. Every single year, no matter how many responses, no matter what audience, the response was essentially always the same. The top three were always the top three, the same ones. And the bottom three were always the same ones. And I always used to laugh because I felt like the bottom three were the ones they needed the most. And the top ones were probably the ones that we needed the least. But that's not how it shook down. So the top three responses almost always were, how do I generate leads? Where do I get more leads? And something else about leads. And the bottom three were always, how do I manage my time? How do I manage my money? And how do I convert my leads? Always across the board, that was the response. And I used to think, what does it matter if you can generate 1 million leads if you can't manage your time or your money or convert them? So yeah, it was always a really interesting experiment because the responses were the same every year.
And it's very interesting because definitely I've heard it quite a bit in pre-COVID at conferences is, the last couple of years, 2018, 2019, one of the big themes at real estate conferences we get pounded over the head with is we don't have a lead generation problem. We've got a lead conversion problem. That's what we've had. And still people are always looking for that one shiny magical lead that they don't have to put any work into, that isn't 3 months away, that's going to price their home properly and not give them any objections. What is that just a human nature issue? Is that a education issue of not understanding all leads are kind of equal? It's in the conversion where that's where the business is. That's where the effort is.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's human nature. We just, we want that comfort of incoming business and we want that, sort of safety net. But I think it's also it's really indicative of the way that we've taught people to run their business, which is just, focus on the business you have. And even though we hear lead conversion, we basically hand brand new agents a stack of business cards and a sign and say, get out there and call everybody you know. We're starting them out with this idea of generate leads, but we're not starting them out with the idea of how are you building an actual business that's going to sustain you for a very long period of time. And maybe that's because our business does have a very high turnover rate. Maybe it doesn't have a very high success rate, especially in market shifts like we're seeing right now. But I think it's just that idea of like, we're not teaching people to build businesses. We're teaching them to generate leads.
Yes. And then the next thing is transactional versus building a business, and that's a topic I've already put on my list of topics. Time management is something I want to talk about. Obviously, conversion of leads and budgeting is really important too as well. So if I gave you a magic wand, and I'm sure continued education for real estate is fairly similar throughout North America. A lot of our continued education is on the legalese of it, opposed to the business part of it, updating us, and it's great education. But if you had a magic wand and you could be any course you could create that was mandatory education for agents across North America, what would be the elevator pitch of that course?
I think if I could only narrow it down to one, it really would be financial. It'd be money management. And I think that has so many facets, right? Somebody asked this question on Facebook the other day too. If you could teach high school students one thing they're not currently being taught, and my first thought was money management. I came out of high school having not a clue how to balance a checkbook or, pay my taxes or plan for my future. Was just operating for the, seat of my pants at that point. You'd get a paycheck and hope and pray. And I think that we're not setting ourselves up for success when we don't, like, we're in an industry that helps people build wealth. Like, this is the best way to build wealth, build generational wealth. And we have a vast majority of people who have been operating in this business their entire career that can't retire because they haven't built wealth, And so we should be teaching people financial skills to be able to invest in property themselves and build wealth that way, but also to build a business that they can essentially sell or they could pass on to someone else. And I think all of that comes back to money management, financial literacy.
And not necessarily always not spending money,
right,
but understanding where you should be spending more money, doubling down on that, creating more leads that are convertible or whatever it is, understanding where to put your money. And if you can't, someone I know used to have this great expression is, if you're not willing to change, if you're not willing to change it, don't measure it. I think Valerie Garcia said that.
No, Ginger Wilcox said that years ago. Only measure what you're willing to change. And I just thought that was brilliant because we do. We have all these metrics. We're not actually doing anything to move the needle on most of them.
Yeah. Now, the next sort of bite I want to talk about is just, it's been this way for probably about 2 months, maybe a month and a half here in my marketplace in Canada. I could sort of sense it was coming about 3 months ago, but we are absolutely in a changing market, without a doubt. And it's probably the biggest change we've seen in our market for maybe 7 years. It's been a steady rise and then a crazy rise over 2 years, but definitely a driver's seat for sellers. And I shared with you, a story back in 2008. I was just having our second kid. The market was changing because of what was happening across the border in the States. Now, it wasn't as dramatic in Canada. It didn't last as long in Canada as it did across the border. And I don't want to make light of that at all, because I know that was a long haul to get things back and going. But I wasn't sleeping at night. We'd just bought a new home. We were having our second kid, and the market was changing in such a drastic way. I'd been through market shifts before, but nothing like it seemed like it was going to be in 2008. And I was working at a small little brokerage here, a boutique brokerage locally, and there was a guy named Wayne, and he was walking the hallways, and he was smiling, and he kind of had a jump in his step, and here I was thinking the world was ending, and he pulled me aside and he said, "Next year will be your best year. It will be my best year." And he was so optimistic. And I said, "Well, where do you see that?" I said, He said, because I've been through 1981, 1982. I saw that a change in a market just meant new opportunities for different people than had the opportunities in previous years. And now I feel like I'm that guy in the hallways at my office where I'm very optimistic about my business and about the opportunities we'll be able to provide our clients. And I think there's a lot of agents that have never been through a market shift that are very apprehensive of their future. And it's really, I think, the skill set, and I want you to speak on it, is there's always a winner in a real estate market, be it a buyer's market, the buyers win, a seller's market, the sellers win, and the balanced market, we all win. We all win. And so it's identifying the opportunity, finding who that opportunity impacts, and then articulating that opportunity to those types of people, and they will win. There's a lot of people out there that have been on couches for years watching the market just run away from them. And now there's going to be a pause and there's going to be an opportunity for them. So what advice do you give for an agent in a market of change in any way?
Well, change is cyclical. It happens all the time to all of us in micro ways and macro ways. Change exists constantly. It is the only constant. And a couple of years ago, when we first headed into COVID, I heard a talk from Jeremy Gutsche, who we both know and really like. And he gave a talk about the cycle of change. And he said, we start at a state of normal, what we think is normal, because that's what we've known for a period of time. We go into a state of crisis. Crisis is the change. It's the, oh my gosh, everything's different or something's different. And it's going to cause us to have to make an adjustment. What follows crisis, however, is a period of chaos. And we have always talked about chaos being a bad thing. Like, when your kid has a room and you're like, clean your room, it's chaotic in here or whatever. Like it's a negative thing. But chaos is a really beautiful part of change. It's the period of time when nothing's certain. We've never done this before. We have absolutely no sense of this is how we've always done it. There's no rules, and there is so much possibility. So early in the pandemic, those first couple of weeks, those first couple of months, we were in a state of chaos because we could do anything. We could do video. We could do closings in parking lots. Like we'd never done things like that before, and we could do anything. What follows chaos is adapt. And what follows adapt is back to normal, a state of normal. And the winners in any change cycle are the people who get to adapt fastest. Those are the winners. So whatever needs to adapt, you've got to get through crisis. Oh my gosh, something's different. And chaos, oh my gosh, I have so much opportunity. And get to, I'm going to make the most of this opportunity, and I'm going to get to a state of normal quicker than anyone else. The fastest person to get there wins. We saw that in 2008. We saw that, with companies that immediately pivoted to handling foreclosures and REOs and, alternate lending options. We've seen that in the beginning of the pandemic 2 years ago, where people immediately went to virtual and embraced video and got on Zoom and shifted their business. And we're seeing that again now in this change. People who are saying, lenders, this is what you need to be educating on right now. This is buyers, this is your time, and this is what it's going to mean. And long term, this is what a 2% increase really means over a period of a 30-year mortgage. And we're seeing people that are immediately pivoting their message and shifting to, this is your opportunity. But I've seen agents who have sat in crisis for the last 2 years. They've literally sat in that crisis stage of, oh my gosh, everything's changing. And they have just swirled in it. And I've seen agents who have sat in chaos too. Like, well, there's so much opportunity and I don't know what to do. Like, I'm just going to wait and see what everybody else does. The people that get to adapt fastest win.
And to spin off what you were saying too as well, the people that adapt get back to normal faster. It's not the same normal, it's the new normal, but it becomes normal again. And so if the only way to get to normal is to go through those stages, whether you delay doing it or not, if you delayed being paperless throughout the pandemic, waiting for the pandemic to stop so you can get back to signing paper, you lost a huge opportunity. Those that were already paperless won really early. Those that learnt to do it very quickly, then got to adapt. You're going to have to go through it. And the one thing that is certain, and you and I agree on, is it is new normal, not 2019 in any way, socially, market-wise, business. That's why it's called the past. It may be similar. It may be reminiscent to times that we've been through before, but we are in as you said, when it came to the Great Resignation conversation, it's a generational change, and that change will impact everything. So it will be a new normal.
I've been telling people for the last 2 years, like, we are never going back to normal. We are never, ever, ever going back to normal. We are going forward to a new normal, because we're never going back to the way things were. After a change like we've gone through, it's, it's reminiscent of 9/11, where we never went back to being able to walk all of our friends to the gate and wave them off on an airplane. We never went back to not having to, put our liquids in a baggie. Like, we're never going to go back to normal, even in this case. And we're going to have customers that from now on say, why do I have to meet you in person? I didn't have to do that during the pandemic. Like, why do I have to do it that way again? I shouldn't have to. I obviously, don't. And so we're going to have to adjust, because our consumers will adjust their expectations.
Now it's time for Been There, Done That.
Tell him he gives me a cup of coffee, I'll answer his questions.
Now it's time for our rapid fire round of 7 questions focused on our guests' years of real estate experience. Valerie has no idea these questions are coming now. Every season, they will be the same 7 questions. So future guests will have a bit of a heads up on what the questions are. But you, once again, are in the guinea pig seat. So here you go. You might have to put your real estate cap on for a couple of years and assume the role of being a realtor. But here we go. Question number 1. You've moved to a new area. What would the number one thing you'd be looking for in a new brokerage?
Ooh. My answer to this would be different a couple of years ago. Like, a couple of years ago, I might have said education. But now I would say a sense of culture, a sense of camaraderie, a sense of people working together as a collective. I think these past couple of years have really changed my viewpoint on doing it all solo. I think there is so much value in having a collective. So I would look for a brokerage that really works on creating a culture of collaboration amongst the people there.
I love that answer. Number 2, what advice would you give an agent who's never experienced a dramatic market shift to help them get the most out of a changing market? Something we've already talked on.
I would say pick up the phone and start calling people who have been through it and start asking for advice and taking that advice. There are some really wonderful, amazing people in this industry that have been through it once or twice or 3 times. And I think we've kind of looked at them as the dinosaurs in this industry for a while, but the elders have wisdom. So I think reach out to the elders and apologize.
Sit down and have a cup of coffee with them and pick their brain.
Yes.
Number 3, in your business today, what is the single activity or product that gives you the best ROI of time and or dollars?
The single activity or product? My newsletter. I would say about 40% of my income at this point comes from my monthly newsletter.
And let's give your newsletter a plug, because it is phenomenal. That's the reason why it's got so good ROI, because it's packed with value. Go to valeriegarcia.com. You can go down to the bottom of the page, sign up for the newsletter. It's absolutely phenomenal. Question number 4. What is the worst movie you legitimately enjoy?
Oh my God. The worst movie I legitimately enjoy. I don't know, like Footloose?
That's good. Confession time. Never seen it. I don't know why. I've never seen Footloose. Number 5. What is the best piece of business advice you've received?
Niche. I would say the best piece of business advice that I've received is niche. I write about that in my newsletter this month, by the way, that's coming out next week. But the idea of niche doesn't mean only. It means, just to get really specific on a particular. And I think a lot of people don't niche because they think that's the only thing that I'm going to be able to do. But if you can get really specific on your target person and what they need, that actually opens up so many more opportunities. So pull the wagons smaller, I think.
Question number 6, 30,000 foot view. What is something you wish you could change about the real estate industry?
I think that I would change the inherent competitiveness between agents. I would like to see more of a collaborative environment in our industry as opposed to me against you. And, maybe it's going to take some fundamental changes like the banning of dual agency or, breaking the buyer commission away from the listing commission. Maybe we're going to have to see some fundamental shifts in order for that to happen. And that's going to be uncomfortable. But I think ultimately that will end up with a more collaborative and hopefully more well-educated and better service mindset for everyone. I think everyone would benefit from that.
I agree. I think being in the marketplace, I'm in British Columbia, dual agency is being banned now for 4 or 5 years. It's hard to remember. I think it is one of the best changes for the consumer and for the industry that we've ever made. I'm surprised it hasn't migrated to other markets. I believe we're probably the only one. I wish it would end up in more marketplaces.
Yeah.
Question number 7. In one sentence, it might not be getting any easier for you. In one sentence, how would you sum up the internet?
Ooh, necessary evil.
There you go. Thank you so much, Valerie Garcia, for being my very first guest and spilling the beans on a variety of topics. And thank you to the listeners for joining Valerie Garcia and myself for a chat about Decaf Determination here at the Real Estate Coffee House podcast. We hope it brewed up some value for you. And remember to enjoy the grind.
That's this week's episode of the Real Estate Coffee House podcast with your host, Michael Thorne. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode. The Real Estate Coffee House podcast is brought to you by Thorne Mazie Bongers Real Estate Group with REMAX Lifestyles Realty in Langley, BC. Thank you for listening.